of ending up with a very big publisher in the UK. HarperCollins is actually owned by News International, so ultimately my work's all being funded by Murdoch, which is a rather odd thought. But it's a changing world, really, that the book industry today. One of the funny things that was sort of cited by people for my book was that I was one of the first, if not the first, fantasy debut novelist that was actually distributed in the UK through Tesco. They took like hundreds of thousands of copies of my book and put it on the supermarket shelves. And that's very odd. You think, well, my success as an author is being dictated by the fact I'm in a supermarket like Tesco. You know, it's not really what you kind of would have considered success. You'd think, well, success is being, you know, really well thought of in places like Waterstones or Borders. But in the modern world, actually going into Tesco alongside all the autobiographies of Naomi Campbell and supermodels and politicians is about as good as it gets, really. And of course, we've got the e-book phenomena now with Amazon Kindle, which is kind of there, and nobody quite knows, I think, if that's going to take off or not and make it a really, you know, different world again. Yes.
You were talking about perspectives and what it's like to be a Victorian person in a Victorian world. You think that nowadays there's a tendency to just pick up the contemporary subject and export it to a Victorian setting and have someone, the characters I mean, think as we think now, but in a Victorian setting, just to help with the identification between the reader and the character?
Oh, very, very much, yeah. I would utterly go with that. I mean, most of the, again, one of the ironies is that the success of my novel in the UK kind of sparked off this big steampunk sort of phenomena, if you like. I mean, I guess the lifestyle thing is independent of that. All the people who like to sort of dress up in 19th century clothes and go to the costuming cons, that's its own little thing. But in terms of the books, they're all kind of, you know, they're all really kind of traditional steampunk, I guess. Which again, I find a little ironic in that, you know, it was kind of the push for my book that gave them the legs to get there. But I wouldn't really class my book as a true steampunk book. I mean, like I say, I was really writing it as a reaction to the fact that all the fantasies I was reading were set in a medieval setting. And indeed, a lot of the popular fantasies of today still are. I mean, George R.R. Martin's all sort of set in that milieu. You have Joe Abercrombie, who's a really, really good writer, but I mean, his books have got so little sword and sorcery in it, and, you know, it really, you could actually set it in, you know, the Italian city-states, and with the sort of subtraction of a few bits of wizardry towards the end of the third book in the series, there wouldn't be that much of a difference, really. I mean, they're very well-written books, but there's very little baggage to get in the way of, you know, the mass readership. And I guess that, you know, you have to decide as an author, who are you writing for? Do you want to be J.K. Rowling? Do you want to have a castle and a Learjet? Or do you just want to write the books you want to write, and, you know, hopefully people will buy them, which I guess is the more sort of traditional approach. But I think if you look at what makes a bestseller, they all have a similarity, which is, even if there is a bit of a detailed world there, they do wear it very, very lightly. And the reason is because the sort of people who will make your book a bestseller in numbers terms aren't the people sitting in this audience. They are the kind of people who will go out and buy a Jordan autobiography, and, you know, that will be their main read on the summer beaches. For them to actually go and buy something different, you know, it has to be simple to a certain degree, which can't, it's not to say it's not good literature in the way of being exciting and a page turner and being fairly well written. There are exceptions to that. I think somebody who's doing quite well now in the UK is China Melville, who some of his earlier works, like, is it Burrito Street Station, can kind of verge into steampunk around the edges, but you know, they are actually quite complex, and, you know, they have a certain amount of surrealism to the subject. Like his more recent one, Kraken, I think would fall into that camp. But you know, whether he would ever sell in J.K. Rowling numbers is probably doubtful, because they're too well written. You know, you basically have to just I use the word dumb down in a kind of non-derogatory sense, but you have to have a certain degree of simplicity, I think, that you do find in YA books, for instance, which is one of the reasons why you see these great big sweeps of bestsellers do tend to come out of the YA world now. Harry Potter was a good example. I think you've got, is it Rick Riordan, the kind of Greek high school boys type thing going on at the moment, which again is the same thing. You'll see lots of adults reading those in the Metro in the US and the UK. And you know, the reason they are popular is because although they're aimed at a reading age of a kind of young teenager, unfortunately, if you're looking at the mass readership of the general public, that's probably where most of their reading ages are. But you know, there are exceptions to those trends. I would hold up Ian M. Banks and his culture novels. They're very intelligent books, but they don't have much in the way of kind of world-building details that will trip up people, if you like.
So maybe I can finish with my original question, which was, usually you have a lot of problems in books that there is an invented technology and an invented world, and then the society seems like hammered into it. Then in your book, you have like, you already knew the society, and you had, as you told, the technology was already there, but you were pushing the technology up. So how much did you have to tweak the society that was historical to get into the book that you wanted?
I mean, not much, I guess, for me. The true core of the society was really, there were kind of exaggerations and reflections, probably more of 18th century England rather than 19th century England. I mean, one of the problems with, if you sort of say, oh, Victoriana and steampunk and that kind of thing, it was actually a very big period. I mean, if you go back to, you know, if you count kind of Georgian England in it, I mean, it's almost like 200 years worth. And the society of, say, late Victorian England, utterly different from the society of early Victorian England in many ways, certainly in technology terms, and in the kind of trades that were being done and the impact of the Industrial Revolution, markedly different. But obviously with a fantasy setting, you don't have to worry too much about that, because you can kind of tweak it around the edges. But I think a lot of the atmosphere and the feel of my books anyway were probably more 18th century than 19th century.
You said you wanted to avoid the historical persons, but did you use some, like, you use the main things from someone historical and then to using a new character?
I would say probably not, with one exception. In the backstory of my created world of the Kingdom of Jackals, there was a kind of a history that 700 years in the past there had been a big civil war, and it was basically an analogue for the English Civil War, where you had royalists against Parliament and cavaliers against Roundheads, and there was basically a Cromwell analogue, who pretty much was Oliver Cromwell in that book, called Kirkhill, and yeah, that was really the only kind of true historical character. I guess some of the politicians I had in the first book were based slightly around sort of Disraeli / Gladstone, if you know your kind of British 19th century politics, but they weren't sort of what you would get in, say, the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, where you get a nice walk-on part for Sherlock Holmes, or a nice walk-on part for, you know, an actual truist, you know, character from history or from the literature of the time. So I just sort of went with really, you know, my own characters on that.
There is no other question. Thank you.
Okay.